Hello, my name is Vadim Karatayev. I work on resilience theory by combining data and dynamical models, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Guelph, specifically studying regime shifts in coupled human-environment systems. So many of the services that pristine ecosystems can provide are public goods, where everyone can benefit from the ecosystem service, but whether you contribute, for instance by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is voluntary. Now, this can encourage players to free ride by using the public good without contributing, but in general, in cooperation problems, for instance, when many players are already mitigating, they can also agree to sanction free riders who are not contributing to mitigation. But for emerging problems where mitigation is expensive, most players initially are not mitigating and therefore will tend to oppose sanctions. And so the key challenge facing many current mitigation efforts is how do we achieve large-scale action for many players as quickly as possible. So recent climate negotiations have been marked by failure to establish an enforceable worldwide mitigation agreement. One reason for this has been the high costs of mitigating climate, for instance, reorienting energy sectors within entire nations and shutting down coal plants before the end of their projected lifespan, but also due to stalemates between the highest emitting players, for instance, China and the United States. So following this, there's been growing emphasis on bottom-up, or in the social science literature, polycentric approaches, where coalitions of proactive states can still at least establish group-specific agreements where individuals only sanction free riders within their own group. Of course, as ecologists, we know that changes such as species invasions or population evolution can happen more slowly in subdivided landscapes. And so in this case, a bottom-up approach might actually slow down mitigation on a global level because mitigating states have reduced influence on free riders outside their own group. Of course, delays in worldwide mitigation are a really big concern, partly due to increasing and irreversible environmental degradation driven by climate change, such as species loss, but also because climate change will tend to disproportionately impact developing nations, which have a limited capacity to adapt. So the key questions I want to focus on here are, first of all, can we combine local and global approaches through sanctioning agreements to try and overcome the high costs of climate mitigation and some of the rivalry that we've been seeing among regions? And following this, can some of these insights from this really extensively studied climate mitigation literature inform some of the ecosystem level restoration where conservation policy often has to happen on a much shorter time scale and providing fewer opportunities to thoroughly evaluate strategies? So I'm going to be using a very general individual-based model of sanctioning agreements, and I'm going to be looking at political entities within groups or coalitions, and these can form around shared geography or political or economic interests. And most of the players initially are non-mitigators, so they're not actively reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And then players continuously decide their strategy choice, so whether to actively mitigate climate or not, depending on the payoffs of each strategy and chance events. Now, overall, reorienting the energy sector of a nation can be quite costly, so we expect very substantially high costs of mitigation, and overall, that will tend to disfavor mitigation. But when mitigators reach a majority, they can establish agreements that sanction non-mitigators. Of course, these agreements can be costly to mitigators as well, even before any kind of sanctions are established. For instance, when we have really intense lobbying surrounding a carbon tax bill that ultimately fails. And so we model negotiations that focus on within-group sanctioning agreements initially, and then shift towards global sanctioning agreements once the global frequency of mitigators becomes sufficiently high. So specifically, we're going to compare approaches where the shift in negotiations happens from local to global agreements, and where the shift happens in early, middle, or late stages of mitigation adoption globally. And we're going to be looking at transient dynamics, where states on average reevaluate their mitigation policy every 2 years. And we're going to measure the total mitigation that, or specifically, which would translate to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, that is achieved within 100 years over many model realizations. So first, when we look at using global agreements from the outset, as we have done with climate negotiations, we find that mitigation always tends to be limited to just a fraction of players. But when we look at mitigation across time and regions within any one of these realizations, we see that chance events, which tend to have little impact on worldwide mitigator frequency, can produce brief periods of large numbers of mitigators within individual regions. And this makes sense. For instance, we've seen that proactive Western European countries, even though they've had a limited impact on global climate negotiations, they have helped establish the mitigation commitments within the European Union. And so, indeed, when we find that an initial focus on local sanctioning agreements helps commit early adopting regions to mitigation. And so local agreements tend to gradually ratchet up mitigation on a worldwide scale. However, when we shift from local to global sanctioning agreements midway, we find that global sanctions quickly pull along lagging regions. And so then if we look over the full range of switching thresholds, we find that it is best to switch to global negotiations about as soon as global sanctioning agreements can be passed. This lines up very well with the 50% majority rule that we use. Now, another key challenge that has come up in climate negotiations is that by investing in mitigation, players might have to forego alternative investment opportunities that can make their group more competitive as a whole. Now, this indirect cost of mitigation can increase between pairs of intensely competing regions. For instance, if Chinese provinces reduce subsidies to smartphone manufacturers in order to fund replacing coal with nuclear power. And so in this case, we find that local sanctions become insufficient by themselves to maintain mitigation commitments within regions that experience intense competition from outside. And in this case, switching to global agreements where you have sanctions that can affect non-mitigators in all regions becomes even more beneficial. Now, I want to discuss a little bit some insights from such climate negotiation work for environmental mitigation within ecosystems. Now, as with sanctioning agreements that reinforce climate mitigation within local human communities, social norms and municipal legislation can reinforce public support for restoration and also help maintain ecosystem services after restoration. And then when public support is high enough at the scale of an entire state, for instance, state-level legislation can expand funding and policies to late adopting areas. Of course, as with climate change, ecosystem mitigation can be quite costly to local communities. For instance, when they have to reorient local economies from resource extraction to recreation or construct new infrastructure. But in the context of ecosystem restoration, we also have these state-level conservation agencies that can increase public support for restoration. And this can occur through, for instance, outreach directly. It also when restoration of natural ecosystem regimes is successful and we restore natural ecosystem services. In particular, these conservation agencies can either distribute their limited resources evenly or focus efforts within a few communities at a time. And so one approach that could accelerate costly ecosystem restoration is to initially focus restoration and legislative efforts in a few communities at a time, and later switch to statewide restoration efforts as soon as statewide legislation can be passed. And so, of course, most successful mitigation projects tended to start with activism by individuals and culminate in larger scale legislation. But the emphasis here is that an apt timing of the shift from local to statewide efforts can boost the pace and efficacy of restoration. So the main emphasis from this talk is that large-scale mitigation might be best achieved using agreements at multiple scales. And the fundamental reason for this is because the processes that underpin cooperation have scale-specific roles, where we've seen that local agreements can capitalize on among-group diversity and chance events by committing early adopting groups to mitigation. And then global agreements, once they become possible, can propagate mitigation by pulling along late adopting and holdout groups. And so possibly the best approach could be to start with local sanctioning agreements, for instance, and switch to global sanctioning agreements as soon as these global agreements can be adopted. And I focused here a lot on agreements that sanction non-mitigators, but really the key piece of the dynamics is to shift the balance of the payoffs during the critical period when states are deciding their long-term climate policy in favor of mitigation. So sanctioning agreements can be combined with mitigation incentives and also other external non-economic things that factor into political decision-making, such as social norms. And then lastly, I think there's a really interesting potential to look at mitigation within ecosystems, where we might be able to boost mitigation by initially focusing restoration and legislative efforts within individual communities, and later focusing on statewide mitigation efforts. So I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to answer your questions throughout the week and hear any of your feedback.